My name is Majestic Lane. I'm Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer for the City of Pittsburgh. That particular role is a role that was a transition of a previous department that we decided to embark on in May of this year. So it's been about 5 months of this particular bureau, if you want to talk about it.
No, we're going to do it.
Well, thank you, Majestic. I met this young man several years ago when he was working for a group in Pittsburgh that was just working around community investment. And he was targeted and slated to move from that position to the mayor's cabinet. Now he's being targeted with leading this new initiative inside the mayor's office in Pittsburgh. So he's doing the job. We're going to give a chance to share out. There's not too many tough questions, but enough questions to take back to Pittsburgh. Secondly, we have Ms. Stephanie Smith, who's not only works for the Baltimore City Department of Planning as their engagement and communications director around equity, but also she holds a political seat in Baltimore as the delegate of the 45th and the 45th district. So she gets to see things from a whole different perspective. Not only she's working in local government, but also she's working on in the role of a state politician around bringing resources to Baltimore City and looking at resources across the state of Maryland. You want to say something?
Thank you, Ron, for your leadership in pulling this all together. I've had a really good time just in the few hours I've already been here. Just wanted to clarify my role. I'm one of 2 assistant directors at the Department of Planning, and my focus is on equity, engagement, and communications. And I do directly oversee the sustainability divisions in our food policy team, also at the agency, and also our policy and data analysis team that has practical oversight over preparing our capital budget for the city.
Now, for us who work in nonprofits, we get a title with a lot of different jobs. So we're real familiar with that. And also, I just want to note that Stephanie does have her director of the agency here. Oh, come on, Chris, stand up. Chris Ryer, come on, Chris, stand up. Yeah, that's important. When I say bringing people along, it's important to bring people along. Because he's reassumed his position in the planning department now as director. And so it's good for him to see and hear the conversation that's going on. So Chris, thank you for being here. Lastly, we've had some cancellations for this third role, but the agency certainly has sent someone who's capable to share that conversation with us. Our Commissioner of Housing, Michael Braverman, was invited to Italy to do a presentation on the work that's going on in Baltimore around community development. So he was unable to fulfill his commitment. And the second person was Jalen Green, who's our CEO of the Baltimore City Department of Housing, who had a meeting, we had the miscommunication, but he had a scheduled meeting with our State Department Head of Housing and Community Development, Secretary Hope. So he's there advocating and discussing, I'm quite sure, with the Secretary of Housing in the state, more resources for Baltimore City. And in his stead, he has sent Ms. Felicia Harris, who's a grant manager with the city of Baltimore. And one of the things I've asked them that I would like them to share on this panel discussion is the work that has gone on in Baltimore for the last year and a half around the City Catalyst Capacity Building Program. So we talk, many conversations about capacity building around here. So we're going to do a little dig down in terms of what Baltimore City is doing around capacity building. Ms. Harris?
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Felicia Harris, and I am the Grant and Investment Manager for the Department of Housing and Community Development, mainly focusing on the Community Catalyst Grant Program. So before anything, I just want to send apologies from Mr. Jalal Green. He would like to be here, but again, he had to meet with the State Department.
If your city hasn't looked at this in terms of being a process that's being implemented, then certainly I'm hoping that you gain some insight from these individuals in terms of how it's going on in this particular city of Baltimore as well as Pittsburgh to take back to your city. Because I'm a believer, that you also, everything can be done differently. and can be done better. So I never want to rest on work that I do, and certainly I challenge those that I talk to on a frequent basis to do something better. So let's start with you, Ms. Justin, in terms of you're outside here in Pittsburgh, and you're in Baltimore. Watch out. Watch out. I'll make sure that we get safety to the door. But talk to us about how you stepped into this role. What you see this role as in terms of equity director in Pittsburgh, and what things that, if you begin to work on, that you'd like to share with us as an audience?
Thank you, Ron. So how I got to this role was I started working for the Purdue administration approximately 3 years ago, first as a deputy chief of neighborhood empowerment. And so what that was basically working with nonprofits, CDCs, and CBOs around the evolving challenges of our city. So one, I think it's just good to give a context for where our city is, where our city's been, and then why we're trying to be thoughtful and intentional about doing this work going forward. Many of you may know Pittsburgh, obviously, for Steelers and the city of Steel and all these kind of things. And also, if you're into kind of urbanism and planning, you'll see that Pittsburgh is often called one of the most livable cities in America. And then at the same time, for African Americans in Pittsburgh, it's fourth from the bottom of the 52 largest metropolitan areas in the quality of life for Black people, right? So what you have here is a situation where you have the most livable city in America broadly, but then specifically for Black folks, a very unlivable city, right? This is about a whole range of different things. So when our administration kind of came in, there was a lot of focus on neighborhoods. So very similar to Baltimore and a lot of other cities. There's a focus on neighborhoods. And sometimes what that means is we're not focusing on people because we're focusing on that place. So people will just say, well, that's Homewood, or that's the Hill District, or that's Sandtown, but not talking about the fact that people are living in those places. So often the solutions have often been, well, we'll just build up brick and mortar. And that building a brick and mortar is often the solution to dealing with the issues of place. While it may be sufficient for place, necessary for place, it's not sufficient for people. So we've been going through a challenge of neighborhood change, neighborhood displacement, and finally seeing the beginnings of gentrification in its past sense. At the same time, we've been seeing an increase in immigrants and refugees coming into our region, where that traditionally was not happening. We've also been seeing the challenges around our schools and actually around our water. So essentially, we were having this neighborhood model, but what we started to recognize that the neighborhood model was not enough. So as of May of this year, we decided to shift to a transition of Office of Equity. And that Office of Equity was really, the goal is to be more people-based and not as much place-based. We still do a lot of place-based work in our economic development strategies. But coming out of the mayor's office and being close to the mayor's office, we really wanted to be much more people and human capital focused than we traditionally had. So this is a shift for us to be able to do this. And a shift for us to be able to see how resources that are coming out of government are actually doing this. I often tell people that government is never neutral. Government either helps or harms you, right? And you may not acknowledge necessarily how it's harming you. It may not be totally apparent how it's harming you. But in these systems are either conspiring to help or conspiring to harm. So this is the first place where I think as a city and a city government, along with some of our other partners, we're really taking the time to say, how has government been complicit in harming? And then what are the best practices for government to be complicit in helping, especially given the income gaps that continue to kind of impact our city. So that's kind of a broad kind of overview of why we did it. And just I'll finally say, our definition, and I'll talk about this appropriately, but our definition looking at racial equity is kind of out of the Government Alliance for Racial Equity definition of that race should not be an indicator of quality of life, right? So.
Well, thank you. So while you're in this space of talking, share with us specifically, you mentioned programs that that Pittsburgh has now implemented. And you can share with us resources. What kind of resources have been allocated to support those programs around, I assume, not an assumption, is that around capacity building or technical systems or capital resources. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so one, I would say one of the biggest things that we looked at was when we identified that we had a housing crisis. And like most cities in America, folks are they cost burden. They're paying over 30% for their housing, and so we're no different in Pittsburgh. So what we did was unique for our city and for electeds in our city. We actually raised taxes through the real estate transfer tax, and so we did that because we acknowledged that that was a place where there's a lot of large transfers taking place in wealth building in the city, and people are selling each other huge buildings and making millions of dollars. So if there's anywhere where you can actually find that resource, and because one of the complaints was, well, that's a progressive tax, right? And you'll often hear from people that those are progressive taxes. So what we did was say that the tax, if you sold a house, it only kicked in if you sold a house for over $160,000. Right, because $160,000 was like the median place where that home was being sold, right? So if you sold it for over $160,000, it kicked in. But if you sold it for under $160,000, it didn't kick in, so that we weren't being harmful or aggressive to folks who, they may be economically precarious around that. And so that was $10 million that went to our Urban Redevelopment Authority, and it also has it's called the Housing Opportunity Fund, and in that it's split up. It's mandated though that half that money has to be spent for 50% AMI and under. So it's identified that was part of the biggest crisis, and that's where we needed to have the resources. But we also knew we did have to have resources to build home ownership, because like in most of your cities, the structure of how things are being built is usually multi-family rental properties and things like that that may have a 15, 20, even 30, depending if you're doing really good right now, year extension on them. So what we try to do is say, okay, well, how can we also help people buy homes to stabilize neighborhoods, as well as some of the other rental housing to do that. Another example I'll say of resources, then I'm talking about a program that we're doing. Another resource program is that actually we have moved $2 million from our government to actually partner with helping child care facilities strengthen their quality. And the reason that this is important too is that the mayor made a focus of child care, acknowledging the role of early childhood education. But what we recognized was it wasn't about creating new seats, it was about strengthening the businesses that are already there. And one of the things that this is helpful when thinking about equity, that equity people's problems don't happen in silos, so your solution should not be siloed, right? If you're looking at equity, trying to solve one problem at a time, we will consistently try to solve one problem at a time, because problems don't function like that. We get problems and strategies, they have many different ways to deal with it. So by investing this $2 million, what we're actually doing is also supporting largely Black women-owned businesses, because we acknowledge that these are the business owners who are actually spending time with these children every day, right? So doing this, it's one, strengthening the care for young people and improving the educational quality of what we call the Keystone Stars. But at the same time, we know we're providing business support, business grants to folks to build their businesses, to be able to strengthen themselves in the neighborhoods too. So that's an example of really how we're trying to be thoughtful about how do we get resources out and how do they have equitable outcomes that are a force multiplier, if you will, for the resources that are spent.
Well, thank you. A lot of cities, and maybe in many of your cities, are using the transfer tax to fund their affordable housing trust funds. And so yours seems like it's a hybrid of that as well, to fund community development activities, particularly around housing. And we'll get into another conversation about who gets the access to those resources. And one important question I want you to think on when I come back to you is trying to describe what does the Black community development ecosystem look like in Pittsburgh?
I would love to talk about that.
Well, let's just turn our attention to Ms. Smith. And I know that she's been intentionally working in the space in terms of her agency and what they've been doing in Baltimore. And so I do want to have her talk about what she's been doing and ensuring that Baltimore becomes a more equitable city in terms of the allocation of resources, particularly in terms of those resources that are allocated to public projects in the city.
Thank you. This next speaker is someone really excited about, and I want to share with you guys. So about, I guess a little over 2.5 years ago, I joined the Baltimore Department of Planning. And I came because actually we had an existing equity and planning committee within the agency. This was just something that, just regular rank and file team members came together and decided that they wanted to have a better understanding of equity in a general sense, but also a better understanding of equity in the context of Baltimore City. People that go to planning school are usually people who just love cities, and you might not end up working in the city that you hail from. So even if you have some understanding of basic concepts, you are inheriting a paradigm, a whole reality that you might not have a deep understanding of from a historical perspective. So they met and they underwent the equity training and they devised an equity action plan. And in the midst of all of this work, the uprising of 2015 happened. So this wasn't an effort that was spawned from the uprising. It was actually an effort that was cemented from the uprising. It's something that staff was really committed to seeing through. And under our prior director, the staff wanted not only the action plan to be implemented, but to have someone at a senior level be in charge of making sure that it's operationalized and real. So I really owe my own colleagues the opportunity to have the job I have because they managed up. Something we don't talk enough about in our lives is that sometimes you can take leadership at any level in an organization to create opportunities to give more space to support your work. So we are a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. We were one of the first cities to have a director of sustainability, and they were undergoing at the macro level an equity effort where they were looking at equity through a four-pronged lens. One is through a structural inequity. How are people just structurally blocked out of opportunity to engage in systems that are controlling their lives, quite frankly? And then the second level is procedural. Procedural is what I think a lot of us kind of forget about. You don't need a law to have your meeting at a time that's more inclusive for community. You don't need a law to make sure that you're actually doing a better job of communicating out what's going on and not telling people at the 11th hour about something. So a lot of what many of us have control of is procedural equity. How am I making it possible for people to really be a part of systems that are going to be contributing to their very lives? Another one that I think sometimes we don't think about enough is transgenerational equity. Are we putting undue burdens on future generations of residents? And that is something I know Ron in some of our conversations with CDN and the strategic planning is that sometimes there is a generational goal in the leadership and community development, right? So sometimes we're making decisions that are going to have a 30, 40, 50-year impact, but is that 20-year-old at the table? Is that 30? Is that even 40-year-old at the table? That's something we have to really be intentional about including. And then lastly, distributional equity. How are power and resources distributed within a population or a geography? Because Baltimore is largely a racially segregated city, when you are distributing power and resources through geography, it is very well distributing power within racial demographic groups as well, just because of the reality, of segregation. So one of the things that we thought would be important in our action plan to focus on is the capital budget for the city. The Department of Planning is not an implementing agency. We work with implementers like the Department of Public Works and DOT and so forth to get our plans to be implemented. But one thing we do take ownership over is that we manage the capital budget process per the city charter of Baltimore. That is unusual. Most planning departments across this country are not tasked with that type of a role. But the capital budget is focused on the land use improvements that Ron mentioned earlier, the streetscaping, the paving of roads, the things that you can see with your eyes that are practical, that can make your community easier to live in, and could also be leveraged to entice other investments and bring other amenities that your community wants to see. So we decided to do an in-house equity analysis of where those dollars were going. And it wasn't really surprising to us. A lot of it was disproportionately going to downtown. Now, when you look at the fact that the capital budget does have to take into consideration any buildings that are owned and managed by the city, there is a disproportionate concentration, including City Hall and the like, that are downtown. But even when you exclude and kind of take out those given city buildings that have to be maintained, there still was a disproportionate amount of capital dollars going downtown. And we wanted to see, well, let's unpack this further. So about 3 years ago, we asked all the major agencies that participate in our city CIP to consider equity when they were making their recommendations to us. Now, this is before I arrived. We had not defined equity, nor did we give it a weight. It was just a consideration. And I think a lot of that was because our agency had been experiencing equity training, had become sensitized to some concepts, but we're interacting with agencies that had not been doing any of that. So in some ways, we really couldn't hold them we couldn't hold them to a full account of something that we knew they were just beginning to understand. But we wanted to plant a seed. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that sometimes we don't do something because it can't be the most precise, beautiful thing, but in the doing nothing, you're just gonna allow whatever the status quo is to keep going. So don't be afraid of taking a small step that you can build upon later. Because we know that the goal was to get to a precise equity instrument that would be weighted, but we didn't wait to get to the weight to start planting thoughts in the agency's leadership. So I just wanted to lift that up. So we just did another review of our capital budget with assistance from the University of Baltimore, and we were able to tease out something that we weren't able to do as officially on the inside. And one of the things we wanted to look at is neighborhood impact, because when we were looking at the community statistical areas that were getting on its face seemingly a lot of capital dollar investment, some of those benefits were not only going to be experienced by that neighborhood or community, they had regional or citywide impact. So if you're in West Baltimore near the reservoir, Druid Hill Park, that is in your community, but the benefit isn't really just for your community. That benefits for everybody. So we wanted to tease out those big impact type of investments versus an investment that's really felt more expressly at the local level. So we realized that communities like Italy and so forth were getting more of those neighborhood investments, and we want to make sure that people have more opportunity to influencing how these requests are coming out of agencies. So when I first came on board, I thought, oh, I'm just going to look at all these policies and I'm going to make them more equitable. Oh, what I realized was that it wasn't a policy that needed to be changed, it was a policy that needed to be created. Because in many ways, inequity thrives in ambiguity. You don't need a process if you're a major stakeholder that can just pick up the phone and get a power broker to make a decision for you. You don't need a procedure when you can just email someone and they respond to you. Procedures and transparent procedures are helping the everyday man and woman to be on the record about what's important to them. So we realized we needed to demystify the capital budget process so that our community leaders and community organizations could get directly to the CIP planners and agencies to kind of really build those relationships, because those requests are coming from people that their names are not on the website, their phone numbers are not on the website. Like, unless you're an insider, how would you know that? We do not have control necessarily over our sister agencies, wanting to put certain people's contact information out there. But what we could do is curate experiences in community where we bring those planners into East Baltimore, into West Baltimore, into South Baltimore, invite community members to talk to them about the things that they would like to see in their community. That was something we had never done before. And it seems like a small thing, but people oftentimes want to make an impact, they just don't know where to begin. Because we have people taking time off of work, going on a Tuesday at 2 p.m. to the Bureau of Municipal Zoning Appeals, and they're asking for something that's not even possible. So they've wasted their time because their strategy didn't even match their reality, and now they're going to be incredibly frustrated by a system, but mainly because they didn't understand how to interact with that system. We're trying to preserve people's time so that their advocacy can be more strategic and that their planning can be more strategic. And I would say the most valuable part of the Planning Academy isn't just really us, it's the fact that people in community are getting to know each other. Because when you're in leadership, it can be lonely. You might feel like you're the only person going through what you're going through, even in your own city. But people have even said, I had no reason to go to South Baltimore, but I met my brother in Westport in this class. Now we're connecting, now I'm learning. And I think that's what we have opportunity to do. I saw that you had a session, I believe, yesterday about building new pipelines of leaders. I think that's what we're trying to do through the Planning Academy, a cohort model that keeps building upon itself so that people get deeper. I think our cities, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, what have you, we cannot entertain continuously having episodic interventions that do not build to anything. It's just a nice shot in the dark. That was good that day. Nice shot in the dark. Things have to build upon each other so people can build the skills and the confidence and the relationships to make whole-scale change. So I feel like I talked too long, so sorry.
That's okay. Because you really pull out of this a couple of questions in my mind. You mentioned there's a recent study that the planning department ended with the Baltimore neighborhood indicators. How much dollar amount was that of capital improvement that was allocated in Baltimore City during this study?
So any year, it's a 6-year capital review period for the CIP. So in any program year, there's usually about $1.2 billion that is at stake. Now, because we're a legacy older city, this probably would be unsurprising to you, anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of our capital budget is dedicated to the Department of Public Works, because we're under many consent decrees with the federal government, to comply with maintenance related to our pipes and so forth. So when we were analyzing the budget, we were just looking at those discretionary dollars that were not basically kind of embargoed, through Department of Public Works, where we had some wiggle room. One of the things that we noted in those remaining dollars is that there's a lack of data, and that's something we're working with our sister agencies to improve. Some people were making requests at kind of a batch request. So if you're saying I'm doing paving, for example, but you're just saying I'm doing it in a quadrant of a city, that's not precise enough for me to map and see which communities are actually getting the paving. So if we didn't do some of this kind of initial work, we wouldn't be able to impress upon these agencies that we need more granular data so that we can better track. So we do have improvements in the last fiscal year of people really mapping out those details. I would say one of our star agencies as it pertains to this work has been the Department of Recs and Parks. I think a lot of it is because we all know where that recreation center is and we all know where that park is, right? So it makes it a little bit easier. But some of the other functions were sometimes batch requests, so we're trying to work with agencies to, in the request, give us the locations, not just on the back end.
Well, I would be concerned about the enforcement. People do business with people who they're comfortable doing it with. And so inside the agencies, you have people who have been there for long periods of time who work with contractors that they had built relationships with over time. Unfortunately, I think I can speak for myself as a community person living in the community. A lot of times when I see those projects that are on the ground, I don't see people that look like me in my community. There are people and locals on those trucks that are coming from outside of our community, which tells me they come in, get the work, but they take their dollars back to their own communities. So one of the things I would be concerned about in terms of how, as a community, in your academy, how is the enforcement being implemented to ensure that those capital dollars that are being allocated are staying and benefiting the communities of Baltimore? Secondly, that those managers, mid-level and upper-level managers, their equity lens and process is also being monitored and enforced to make sure that they are making their decisions based around an equity framework instead of just a personal relationship.
I'm so glad you mentioned this because I had neglected to mention that because of the work we were doing in the Department of Planning just voluntarily around equity, then Council Member Brandon Scott introduced a bill to require all agencies to actually have an equity officer and to have an equity plan of their own. So that went into effect about this time last year. And due to the ransomware and some of those technical glitches, there's been an extension in the first round of compliance. So by the middle of next year, every agency should have identified not only an equity officer that reports to the director of the agency, which is very important. They also have to undergo a series of trainings at the senior level of their agency and also agency-wide within their leadership team. So it really is acknowledging, to be frank, that some agencies, this is a very nascent conversation. Like, you can't even get into compliance with the plan because they're not ready to create a plan because they don't even understand what equity is about. We just became a member of AIR that you mentioned, Government Alliance on Racial and Equity. So we are in many ways a part of a movement that is really interesting because of two things. When King County, Seattle, Washington, and I believe Portland, Oregon embarked on their equity effort, it was really championed by a mayor or a county executive. And as you also probably know, the demographics and the financial realities of the cities are very different than Baltimore City. Baltimore is one of the first majority Black major cities to really embark on this effort. But notice that it was a legislative effort, not an effort that's just something coming from the executive. So what that means is that based on the legislation, agencies have to, like I said, get an equity officer, train their leadership team, come up with an action plan, report annually to the mayor and city council on what they're doing and their progress on that. My understanding at this point, 96% of all agencies have that equity officer. That is a really good turnaround in a few months, to be frank, in about 5 months of really having someone at City Hall that's, I guess what's the word, empowered to oversee the compliance of this whole program. We didn't have that a year ago. So you really need someone to own the work, and it can't be something that's pushed down to a junior person to solve, because that's not how change is really going to happen. But in terms of the compliance piece, for us, we as the planning department, we could suggest and cajole our sister agencies to consider equity and their recommendations on the, for the CIP. But now there's legislation requiring them not only to consider equity in that specific instance, but in all of their policies and practices. So I feel in some ways we have some wind at our back to take what was essentially a project of our agency, but now we can actually have a little more teeth in working with our sister agencies.
Well, thank you, thank you. So, Ms. Harris,
Hi.
you work at the Baltimore City Department of Housing and Community Development.
Yes.
Your director, your commissioner is newly appointed. Previously, the department was under the heading of the Baltimore City Housing
Correct.
Department. And so those community advocates in Baltimore City said, no, it's just not housing, it's community development. And so we want to put a more comprehensive lens about the work that we're doing in this department, and it needs to go on in Baltimore City.
Correct.
So I applaud the outgoing mayor and the new incoming mayor for supporting that agency, and certainly your commissioner has been very busy over the last 2.5 years moving his agenda around community development. He's come up with a very unique initiative called the Baltimore City Catalyst Program, which has 3 components attached to it. There has a component that looks at supporting operating costs for groups that have historically been shut out of the pipeline of resources. It supports them through capacity, technical assistance, and of course the other piece that many of them do need is capital funding. And so why don't you share with us, as a spokesman now for the commissioner, we wish him well in Italy. Well, talk to us a little about that program, because 2/3 of the program has now been initiated.
Correct.
The operating component as well as the capital component.
Correct.
So talk to us about where the vision is going and what the impact you're seeing through this program.
Okay. As you said, DHCD and working with the City of Baltimore and the City Administration. Hello, mic check. Okay, cool. DHCD working with the city's administration wanted to shift the focus of where they invested in these different neighborhoods. So with that, they created a new era of neighborhood investment. And with that focus in mind, they wanted to identify funds and make funds available for these neighborhoods and these emerging organizations, as well as historically disinvested neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that have has a lack of capital funds, have a legacy of segregation, as well as racial inequity. And from that, we looked at and developed the Community Catalyst Grant Program. So the Community Catalyst Grant Program, with that creation, we met with different community members, met with our stakeholders, posted the information on our website so that the community can be able to give their input and speak on this before it's actually put into place. So from their feedback and from their input, we created the guidelines and put in place the application. So the application it was for the operating grant, because so it's 3 components, as you said. It's the operating grant program, it's the capital grant program, as well as the technical assistance. So from the operating grant, that was due last year in October 30th, 2018. And we had over 100 applications from these different communities to come in and are interested in this funding. From that, we dedicated to the operating program is $2 million. So for that, we had a request of about $7 million for just $2 million. And then from that process, we work with our different review panels to try to get this funding back to these communities. Also, for the capital grant will be back in March. And that was an allocation of $3 million, but we received about $22 million in requests for these funds. So these funds it shows that these funds are extremely needed within these communities, and that these communities are really ready for a change. With that being said, we awarded about 35 groups for the operating grant and 25 groups for the capital grant. Just to show you, we have three of our awardees here today. Mr. Campbell from the FPA, which is the Forest Park Alliance, Ms. Khalees Williamson for Grace Corporation, as well as we have Leaders of Beautiful Struggle in the room. And with those organizations and working with those organizations, building stronger partnerships with DHCD as well as these organizations, giving them funding so that they can be able to build capacity as well as work on these projects within their communities and build a stronger impact with the city.
Okay. You know, this program that has launched in Baltimore the last year and a half has been very critical and important, which is siphoning resources into communities, into organizations that have been historically shut out. Unfortunately, in the history of Baltimore in the last 17 years, I've seen major disinvestment in communities of color. So with the election of the outgoing Mayor Catherine Pugh, working with her new administration, working with community stakeholders in Baltimore City, this new initiative evolved. And it evolved like anything else when you're birthing a new idea. There's some pain, there's some disgruntlement going on, but at the end of the day, it birthed itself. And it's been now 1 year in terms of allocating resources. And in talking with the commissioner, I know that he wants to see more resources allocated in coming year. I will say this, and correct me if I'm, Ms. Harris, if I'm incorrect, but I believe these funds came out of Baltimore City general operating budget. Is that my understanding, or were they federal funded resources?
It came from DHCD's budget.
Okay.
So yeah, it wasn't federal funding.
Okay, no federal funding. So again, we talk about innovative strategies and approaches that you can implement in your city. Again, Majestic had mentioned how they're using transfer tax to fund their initiatives in Pittsburgh. I know in Baltimore we're doing, some of that is going on around the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. In the District of Columbia, we've done it as well as putting money out of the general operating budget to support the Housing Trust Fund in Washington, D.C. So let's dig down a little deeper in terms of, Ms. Jessica, I asked you a question about the Black ecosystem of community development in Pittsburgh, and so you wanted to share some thoughts with us around that.
So I would say, so I'll give you an answer and then talk about why I give you an answer.
Go ahead.
The Black community development ecosystem is largely invisible or not there or on its last leg. I say that because I would argue our community development ecosystem has also been deeply weakened across the board. The reason for that is, I think one, you got to start with certain towns are led by certain industries or certain structures. So you have cities where, you know, the city government is the main game in town. You have cities where businesses are the main game in town. Pittsburgh is unique. We have a city where philanthropy is really the main game in town. And during the time, and everyone knows about 1979, the mayor often talks about The Bucks won, the Pirates won, the Steelers won, and the lights went out. And so what happened when you lose that level of tax base, who came up to almost support and prop up the city was philanthropy. So philanthropy then started, frankly, determining the direction of the city. And much of the success stories, when you hear about Pittsburgh, it's about a conversation of a table of all the different stakeholders, right? But for a long time, some corporations and philanthropy were really the leaders of that table, right? So that's how Pittsburgh ended up differently than other cities in this regard. So when the city almost decentralizes power around community development, it often fell to philanthropy. Ford was a huge investor in Pittsburgh for a long time, and then our local foundations often picked up the slack. So with that though, winners and losers were created, right? And often the winners were organizations ran by white people in black or black adjacent neighborhoods who had developed the skills and capacity to do economic development throughout that time. Doing community development and then shifting when the federal government was still funding stuff to do economic development. So that became the general structure, albeit a couple of organizations in our neighborhood we have called Homewood that had a history of folks being able to do some things and build some things when that executive director eventually became executive director of our housing authority and such. But that was the exception, not the rule. So in about 2007 or 8, we had a governor Rendell essentially, who funded our Main Street programs and our community development programs like they were going out of style. Ever since then, the money has slowly been going down, right? And so in the middle, so foundations who were once propping it up, now you see tax credit programs. So traditionally, where tax credit programs were being used to fund affordable housing, now tax credit programs are being used to fund community organizations. So businesses and different folks are now taking the tax benefit. So in this system, as we know how the role race plays, if you're not at those tables and you don't have those relationships, the black community development organizations aren't really there. And the ones that are there because they've been identified by philanthropy as leadership, right? That may or may not have a connection to people in the community who they may identify as leadership. Because essentially, I don't know how y'all do it here or in other cities, but the Community Development Corporation, really the only people that they have to report to is actually their board, right? So they don't have a broader sense of having to report to anybody. At the end of the day, my boss has a 4-year referendum on if he should have his job or not, right? But the Community Development Corporations, in the sense of if they're not really equitable and engaging community, don't have that. They report to 12 people. And if those 12 people like it or don't like it, that's actually what's done. So for us, our ecosystem, our broader community development ecosystem is challenged because we also had what I called last night disaster capitalism. So developers became the most important person in the room for generations because they were the ones putting money in to save the city. And we're just getting out of that phase of our existence where developers are the most important person that saves the city. And even city government saying, okay, you've made a lot of money. You've done good, but you've made a lot of money, and we need to transition to what the future of the city looks like. So our black community development ecosystem is in a precarious position. Also, I will say there's more money right now being put into community organizing from philanthropy than community development, which is a transition that they've made relatively recently, right? So you don't see as much money going into the organizations to really do, brick and mortar work. You see very little money going into workforce development work. I don't know how the CDC world functions here, but very little going into workforce development. And you see more going into to organizing around particular interests that are specific to those philanthropic groups.
Well, let me ask this add-on question. If you're looking at Pittsburgh and looking at the wealth and wealth generation in Pittsburgh, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that is also one of the biggest challenges we're having, that we're looking at the symptoms of things versus the actual sickness, if you will. I argue to folks that affordable housing is a proxy for economic vulnerability. If you have people that are cost burdened and can't afford things, that's because they're economically vulnerable. I tried out a number that I don't like to trot out, but the median income for the average Pittsburgher is $19,000. So if we want to just extend this conversation, if the median income is $19,000, what house would you buy? Right? Yeah, you can't, if you have a $300 emergency, yes, you're going to be out of doors, right? But it's sometimes easier to deal with the symptoms of the problem than the problem. So sometimes people will say, okay, you're right, we're going to put millions of dollars into affordable housing. We're going to do another 9% tax credit deal. We're going to do a 4% tax credit deal. We're going to do a 203B. The housing authority is going to get you 100 more vouchers, right? But you still haven't touched the fundamental issue of the racial wealth gap, right? And I think when we're having this conversation about the racial wealth gap, it requires us to have a root cause conversation of the relationship of employment and the structural factors that served Pittsburgh well that no longer serve Pittsburgh well. The largest employer in the state of Pennsylvania is our medical center, UPMC. The largest employer of black people in Pittsburgh is the medical center, UPMC. Up until relatively recently, only a small percentage of them made over $40,000. So when we're talking about this broader dialogue of trying to think about how we get to the racial wealth gap, right? How we talk about home ownership. So even if we're positing home ownership as an essential, what I think it is, an essential part of wealth building, well, at a median income of $19,000, it's only a certain amount of people who want to do that anyway. And what we've seen is, interestingly enough, even with some of our labor unions who have fought for higher wages, when people are making more money, they're leaving the city. Right? Like, they fight to get more money. They get more money. And then they say, my money goes a lot further in Penn Hills or in Edgewood than it does in the middle of the city. So we're seeing some of those challenges. So even the labor unions who are a huge, workforce and a huge part of our city, when they get other opportunities, they may be choosing them. And that's not a bad judgment. So I just think that now we're just having the broader, beginning to have a conversation. Okay, what is the relationship of racial wealth gap, right? And how can city government be thoughtful? We can do NWBE work, right? We're long overdue for NWBE work. We have invested in financial empowerment centers. So we invested in financial empowerment centers because one thing we identified was that many people have goals and ideas, and what we all take for granted as maybe support and thinking about financial decision making, a lot of folks who don't have a lot of people to talk to about financial decision making, right, and how they want to use their resources. One of the things I wanted to mention too was around your conversation of the contracts. So until literally last week, we had a host of contracts that were what they call zero-sum contracts. So folks that may be in that world know that zero-sum contract is someone that gets a contract, but you haven't given them any money for it yet, right? They are basically on call to do work. So we've had a lot of landslides. So when a landslide happens, then we have to get to a person that's on call. Well, who's on call for a landslide contract? The folks who've always been on call for landslide contracts. They've always been involved with DPW. They've always been involved in these places. They have a cousin that works at DPW. I mean, this happens every city, so it's not ours. I'm not ashamed to talk about it. So of course, those are the folks who get the contract. And then before literally last week, we didn't have a way to identify the contract or if they called any NWEs or WBEs to do any subcontracting. In fact, only last week do we have the ability to now say to our departments, and there's some pushback on this, right? Because the department is like, I need speed, right? We got a landslide, I need to get the landslide fixed, which is true. But the question is, when you did that, did you prep to think about who your subs would be when the work came? Right? And if you think about who the subs are going to be when the work comes, you can give them an idea of what could be coming down the pipe, right? And another one thing that we're doing that I think is going to have a huge impact is a buying plan. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with a buying plan. We're involved with Living Cities on equity and procurement process. And one of the biggest things that you can do is we know that a lot of subs, NWE subs, they're waiting to see what contracts come out. And so a contract comes out, and they had 3 weeks or a month to be able to try to respond to a contract. They got to get bonding, they got to try to get the finances to fund something, right? So what we are working on now is doing a line plan, meaning the year, like anything that we're going to be doing in the city will come out a year in advance. And then anything that any of our authorities will be doing will come out a year in advance. Why does that help? Because then people can actually put their plans together and think about what they want to apply for a year in advance, right? So these are some of the smaller things that, again, I'm using inside government that people have never even challenged. Because they never thought that they were doing something wrong, because they always thought government was neutral.
Well, thank you. We're running a little behind, still trying to catch up. So I'm going to just make one statement, and then I'm going to open up the floor for your questions. This conversation around equity can't happen in a silo without talking about capacity. And you clearly have recognized that. If there's no one on the back end to do the work, then it goes to the folks who people have always called on to do the work. So there has to be some movement around how we create capacity in our network, in our ecosystem, for small businesses, around nonprofit development, so that we can actualize the work that needs to go on in many of our communities. So I know that there's some pressing questions you want to address to our panelists. So let's take the next few moments. Mr. Brown is to my right. You can come get one of these mics, Mr. Brown, and you can go to the mic and ask your specific questions. Thank you.
While we're waiting for anybody to come up and ask a question, our panelists and moderators for the next session, if you want to go to your room to get started or whatever, feel free. I'll be down here to show you where your room is.
Hello again, my name is Ronald Meyer. I have a question, Dr. Smith. I have observed the capital improvement program for a number of years, and I was just wondering, even as I look around the room, how successful have you been in regard to educating our communities to get into that scheduling and time frame for them taking a leadership role in dealing with capital improvement?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for that question, Mr. Miles. I think we've made some marginal steps in the right direction. I'm someone that's never satisfied, so you'll probably never hear, that's great for me, because I just feel like the work's never done, so to speak, right? But we were never educating the community about it. You see what I'm saying? We're going from zero to something. And I think we thought, well, you know, we'd be happy if 15 people come out to a CIP, outreach. And when 60 people came, that was at Fort Worthington, that we piggybacked on a community meeting, but it's still a good thing. And then in West Baltimore, we went to the police district. We had about 45 people at that too. This is something really boring. You're taking time out of your life to learn more about it. The thirst to know is high, and we also embedded in our curriculum for the academy. So we accepted 2 cohorts at once, a fall and spring. We just wrapped that up last April, and then we opened it up again this summer, and we privileged applicants that applied before, because we can't have more than 30 people in a room and people really build relationship. We do put all of the presentations online and even archive video of the presenters. So we're not hiding the information, but we want to cherish that relationship of the cohort model to build those connections. So then we thought, well, maybe a lot of people would apply for the last time. Only out of 270 applicants this summer, only 20 were repeats from last summer. So we've had over 500 people in the city who want this information. So I think that it was also a signal to our city leadership, people want to know this. I don't think they realize how much people want to feel like they understand this.
I don't know, I'm going to make a comment, and I know it's not related to a question. And I'm going to speak specifically to my experiences in Baltimore. And judging by what Majestic shared with us in Pittsburgh, it's resonating to a lot of communities. And when we talk about this disconnect between organizations, And we have to do a better job of building our capacity through relationships. I don't think we look at that in terms of an equity lens and the importance of how collaboration helps build intentionality in our movement work that we need to do. No one has to do everything. There's not enough resources for anyone to do everything. Foundations, as Majestic has shared, they're pulling back their dollars in many areas, particularly in our community development. They're not supporting that work. They're more likely to support public institutions. And one of the things I always argue, how do you have a youth program where you bring the youth out and you can't support mom and dad having a good, stable income? That just doesn't make sense to me. So you send a kid back to a home where there's no refrigeration, there's no food, probably dealing with issues around livability, but yet you call yourself in the foundation supporting a family. Something's wrong with that thinking. And so I know that's not a question we're going to answer here, but it's a question that we can challenge local foundations around their priorities. Their priorities. Because they bring an inequitable racial lens to the work they do, because many of them are family foundations who pass on their own pathologies, from family member to family member. And for those of us who manage and still manage community associations or CDC that seek funding, we know what the experiences are when you write your best proposal and somebody tells you, well, we can't fund it. But it addresses the need. It addresses the need for resources, but you see other groups that get those resources that you be equity for going to other communities. So there's a lot, again, we're not going to solve all these issues here at this symposium, but we got to be aware and awoke to what's happening in our communities. So we're going to, is there anyone, one last question? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mayor Nicole Nesby from the city of Duquesne, Pennsylvania. And it's ironic that you're here from the city of Pittsburgh, and my city is 15 minutes outside of your city with limit lines. And my economic conditions in my city are similar to that in a third world country, where 80% of my community is 110% below the federal poverty line, and 40% of that 80 have a criminal background in selling drugs. And it goes on and on and on. With the first time parent in my city is 15. I have nearly 5 generations of documented illiteracy. It was plagued by generations of nepotism. So when we talk about the contractual agreements and the phone calls, that takes place. And trying to move forward in my situation where there's 70% of my community is African American, how do you break the barrier to move the city forward where the community doesn't understand, but that hold of that 27% of white people who have controlled the city is still controlling it even though they're not physically there?
So I know that the Mon Valley, which you're speaking of, has a very unique history. One history of black folk and history of white folks, and then the history of some other stuff. So I think one of our challenges, and this is a real thing for us. I always tell people, city of Pittsburgh, our borders, there are no walls. The difference is what's happening between the city and the county are almost identical. And now, frankly, the young people, the way they've done their new formations around different things they're into, they've aligned across neighborhood boundaries. They jump across neighborhood boundaries, sometimes even to do illicit acts and crime, right? So I think, Mayor Nesby, and I credit much of your work at trying to bring more people to the table and kind of elevate this conversation, especially around the Mon Valley, where I think, unfortunately, it's a different dialogue in the city, right? Both from a voting perspective and then from an institutional perspective. I think that, finding the partners that cut across the barriers is a really important thing. Finding those who, folks I know you have worked with in the past and continue to work with, where elected officials do want to do work, and I underscore where elected officials want to do work. Also, I think is an important piece of it. Our region has a challenge because again, much of stuff is so neighborhood-based or localized-based, so if philanthropy takes an interest in one particular neighborhood, they have all the money in the world. A place right next door to it will not receive a dime. Right? And that is literally just because they have an interest in it. And sometimes it has an economic development interest, right? So I think, to reinforce my point, I think finding the partners in Braddock, right, and finding the partners in Wilkinsburg, right, and finding the partners and folks who want to see more regional identity is an important thing, because right now, even though the borders are porous, we still kind of focus on that. I mean, I'm guilty of it in the sense that right now is one of the first times we're doing some group violence intervention work that we acknowledge it has to go into account. Like, it can't stop at our border, right? Like, we have to do some partnership, because we can't assume that, like, if something happens in the neighborhood, and once it jumps out to Allegheny County, we just go, oh, okay, it's not our problem anymore. No, it's all of our problems, but it's our regional issue. So I think you'll see some stuff we're trying to work on around that. And at the same time, I don't know the work, or if you've had conversations with PCRG and Ernie Hogan, but if you haven't, I would suggest to talk to Ernie about some either resources that may be the case, or just a broader assistance around economic development.
Well, the sessions are getting ready to start. 2 o'clock? Okay. Okay, we have another 15 minutes. So let's do just a debrief, folks. First of all, I just want to thank you panelists for coming and sharing with us afternoon. And so, while we're convening the last day today, this is not the last day. Because the work really has to go on beyond today and taking back these learned lessons and see how we stay connected over the months and weeks ahead. I will go over some action items early on that we're looking at initiating with your participation going forward. Because there's still so much to be done in our communities that we serve. So much, as we heard yesterday from Dr. Statter, in terms of this whole conversation around wealth and how wealth is explored in our communities, and in many ways still is. Many of our communities are still being red line, where economic development and wealth building is not taking place. So the work is not over. As they say, it's just beginning. And so I want you to really think of the things that we're doing and things that we could be doing. Because there's so much reliance on us and our organizations. It's just unimaginable. Folks in our neighborhoods are looking to us. And our cities are looking to us to guide some of this work. Because they don't have all the answers. But I know, as I was saying, it's like collectively, we can come up with answers to solve the many problems that we see occurring today. You're going to be certainly blessed today with a wonderful panel to start the conversation.